By the late 12th century, tensions between the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin had reached a breaking point. Saladin had unified Muslim territories in Egypt and Syria and sought to reclaim Jerusalem from the Western European Christians, particularly the Franks. A truce between Saladin and the Crusaders was repeatedly undermined, particularly by Raynald of Châtillon, Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, who attacked Muslim caravans, including one allegedly carrying Saladin's sister, in which she was killed. In response, Saladin launched a major campaign in 1187, mobilizing an army in the region of 20,000 to 30,000 men, including a large contingent of Turkish and Kurdish cavalry, as well as archers and infantry. His primary target was Tiberias, a city in Galilee under Crusader control. Saladin's forces besieged the city in late June 1187. The Crusaders, led by King G of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem at that time, mustered a force of around 15,000 to 20,000 men, including the military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, feudal levies, and knights from various Crusader baronies, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the Order of Saint Lazarus. The bulk of the army was made up of infantry, with roughly 1,200 mounted Christian knights in the ranks. Despite warnings from some of his commanders, such as Raymond III of Tripoli, King G decided to march the army east to relieve the siege of Tiberias. His force marched in 3 columns. The infantry marched on the outside, surrounding and protecting the cavalry from any potential ambush along the way. King G's decision to march out was his belief that he could surprise Saladin or force a decisive battle on open terrain, a belief which was coiled in arrogance and a sheer lack of military experience. After many hours of marching, the exhausted and dehydrated Crusader army had reached the arid plain near the Horns of Hattin, 2 volcanic hills that gave the battlefield its name. Unbeknownst to them, the Crusaders had walked straight into Saladin's trap. Saladin's mounted horse archers sprung out and encircled the Crusaders from all directions. The Crusaders opted to continue marching. However, the arrow fire and heavy armor made it difficult for the men to proceed, so they opted to form defensive circles around the cavalry to protect the exposed horses from the immense arrow fire. The defensive formation of the Crusaders was enough to stave off the bulk of the attack. However, Saladin's horse archers had trapped the Crusaders in place, isolating them further from a much-needed fresh water source. Without water, the heat of the desert would swiftly turn on King G's men, and mass casualties and routing would inevitably ensue. And to make matters worse, nighttime was fast approaching with no end in sight. Saladin's cavalry tested the Crusader infantry ranks by charging at them and quickly disengaging before they had enough time to form up their knights. Unfortunately for the Crusaders, things would only begin to get much worse. During the night, they had set up their camps hoping the attack had ended for the day and they could get some much-needed rest. This, however, was not to be the case. Saladin's skirmisher cavalry continued to harass the Crusaders in their camps. They loosed arrows and set fire to their tents, leading to screens of hot smoke streaming across their tents, only worsening the heat and further adding to the misery of the already exhausted, dehydrated, and heat-stricken Christian troops. By this point, all that was on the Crusaders' minds was to get to the nearest water source by any means necessary. The following morning, July 4th, the Crusaders, thirsty and demoralized, broke camp and changed direction towards the springs of Hattin, utterly desperate to reach the water wells before severe dehydration sets in and King Guy's army utterly deteriorates. They continued their advance but were blinded by smoke from fires from afar set by Saladin's cavalry. The hot smoke alongside the hot blistering sun only added to their troubles. Saladin's forces were fresh and fully resupplied throughout the night. They stalked the Crusaders. Saladin watched carefully to see what King G would do next. Observing the Christians maneuver towards the village of Hattin, Saladin swiftly ordered his cavalry to block their path. The Muslim cavalry ferociously fired projectiles and used hit-and-run charges against the vulnerable Crusader infantry. Although utterly surrounded, the Christian soldiers pressed onwards, fully determined to reach the water wells at Hattin. The Muslim cavalry are careful not to get tied up in a prolonged melee, as the Crusader cavalry and heavy mounted knights, although not at full strength, are still extremely dangerous and detrimental if caught from a frontal charge. They keep their distance, slowly dwindling down the Christian infantry and drawing out any stragglers. By this point, the cohesion of the Crusader formation begins to crack. Many of the infantry break off from the formation and begin fleeing in all directions. Many flee east towards Hattin, with some fleeing northward toward the town of Nimrin. With this desperate action, an opportunity arises for the Muslim cavalry to exploit. Saladin acts swiftly, sending forth his heavy cavalry to begin attacking the now disorganized Crusader formation. Surprisingly, the Muslim cavalry allow the infantry to escape through gaps, their attention focused towards the Christian knights, the commanders, and capturing the True Cross, which would utterly crush the morale of the entire Christian army and send panic throughout the entirety of the Crusader kingdoms. Now, with momentum on his side, Saladin orders the remainder of his force to close in on the Crusaders and surround their position. With a large section of Crusader infantry having fled the battlefield, King G and his knights are abandoned and attacked by heavy Muslim riders. They surround their king and the True Cross and fight to defend them both fiercely, whilst attempting to make their way towards the Horns of Hattin. The Crusaders formed defensive circles, but discipline and morale was all but lost. Multiple cavalry charges, including desperate efforts by the Templars, were repelled. By this stage, the fight evolved into more of a struggle for survival, as opposed to a battle. The True Cross was captured by the Muslims in the heat of the fighting, inevitably signaling the end of the struggle, quickly followed by Muslim forces overwhelming the knights and infantry. King G ordered his remaining men to surrender. The defeat was catastrophic for the Crusaders. Most of the Crusader nobility were captured, including King G, Raynald of Chatillon, and the Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers. Saladin executed Raynald personally, in revenge for his attacks on Muslim caravans. The Templar and Hospitaller knights were also mostly executed, considered too dangerous to ransom. Only a few managed to escape, notably Balian of Ibelin and Raymond of Tripoli. Following Hattin, Saladin rapidly captured Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, and eventually Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, with relatively little resistance, as the Crusader military strength was shattered. The Battle of Hattin marked the effective end of Christian power in the Holy Land for decades. It led directly to the Third Crusade from 1189 to 1192, launched by Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa to recover Jerusalem. Saladin's victory elevated his reputation across the Islamic world and earned him legendary status in both Muslim and Christian chronicles.